The millionaire's triplets couldn't walk until he saw what the nanny was doing behind his back. Imagine a father, wealthy and powerful, convinced by doctors that his 3 children would never stand on their own. And then, one night, he stumbles upon a scene that changes everything. Hi, I'm John Parker, and today's story will touch your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give your like, it means so much to me, and leave in the comments which city or country you are listening from. Now, let's begin. The night was colder than usual in Portland, Oregon, where the rain tapped gently on the windows of a mansion that stood high on the West Hills. Inside that house lived Richard Halstrom, a 42-year-old millionaire developer. His world had turned upside down the day his wife died, giving birth to their triplets, 3 boys with eyes as blue as hers. The tragedy left him shattered, and soon after, doctors added another blow. The children suffered from a rare neuromuscular condition. They won't walk for years, if ever, the specialists had told him. Richard, despite all his power, fortune, and influence, felt powerless. He invested in imported medical equipment, hired the best therapists from Seattle and Los Angeles, and transformed his living room into a private rehabilitation center. Yet, after more than a year of effort, the results were discouraging. The triplets, Ethan, Caleb, and Noah, remained dependent on wheelchairs and braces, their fragile legs refusing to respond. Every evening, Richard would come home from his corporate empire, the towering Halstrom construction group, only to be met by the silence of machines, sterile smells, and the hollow sound of failure. The mansion, once filled with dreams of family laughter, had become a place of quiet despair. That is, until he hired Clara Reynolds. She wasn't like the other professional caretakers with long resumes and cold clinical methods. Clara was in her 40s, with simple clothes, warm brown eyes, and the kind of calm that seemed unshakable. She had been recommended by an old family friend, introduced simply as a woman with experience caring for special children. Richard hadn't asked many questions. He was desperate. For weeks, nothing appeared unusual. She cared for the triplets, sang softly while feeding them, and followed the therapist's instructions, at least when Richard was present. But on that March evening, when Richard returned home earlier than expected, he froze at the doorway to the living room. The triplets were on the floor, not strapped to braces, not confined to wheelchairs, on the floor. Their tiny legs trembled, but they were trying, truly trying, to hold themselves upright, leaning on the edge of the couch, their faces glowing with determination. And behind them, Clara, clapping, whispering old melodies, encouraging them. With every breath, Richard's throat closed. "What on earth?" he muttered, his voice shaking. The scene before him shattered everything he thought he knew. The doctors had promised him years of waiting, of pain, of hopeless protocols. Yet here were his sons, his 3 miracles, trying to stand for the first time, and all because of the nanny, doing something he had never been told about. But what exactly was Clara doing behind his back? That question burned in Richard's mind, and as his heart pounded in his chest, he realized this was just the beginning of a revelation that would test his faith, his family, and everything he believed about love, loyalty, and truth. And as he stepped into the room, not knowing whether to cry or shout, the triplets' laughter filled the house for the first time since their mother's death. But Richard didn't know yet. Those laughs carried secrets that would soon divide his family, expose betrayals, and unlock a hidden past he never imagined existed. The truth was standing right in front of him. And the moment he chose to confront Clara would change all their lives forever. Richard's voice echoed through the living room, trembling between disbelief and anger. "Clara, what are you doing with my sons?" The nanny turned, her palms still open from clapping, her face radiant with a smile that didn't match the storm in his tone. "Good evening, Mr. Halstrom. They're just playing. Children need play. But these weren't ordinary children, Richard thought. They were his triplets, Ethan, Caleb and Noah. Boys who had been written off by medical specialists, bound to a prognosis of silence and stillness. Yet here they were, trembling but upright, their little fingers gripping the edge of the couch, as if defying fate itself. Richard dropped his briefcase on the floor. The sound startled the boys, and Ethan stumbled back onto the rug. Richard rushed forward, his instinct colliding with fear. He lifted his son, feeling the fragile bones, terrified he might have undone months of therapy in seconds. But Ethan's laughter filled the air, free and unrestrained. Clara knelt beside them. "Don't be afraid, Mr. Halstrom. They are stronger than you think." Her calmness infuriated him. Stronger. Do you understand how much money I've spent on specialists, on equipment, on... He pointed toward the sterile corner where braces, machines and therapy balls sat untouched. "This isn't a game. If you keep pushing them like this, they could be hurt permanently." For the first time, Clara's eyes darkened. Or maybe they could be healed permanently. Those words pierced through him like an arrow. He couldn't answer because somewhere inside he wanted to believe her. But the face of Dr. Margaret Ellison, his sister-in-law and one of Portland's most respected neurologists, rose in his mind. She had been his anchor since his wife died, the voice of reason who insisted on protocols, charts and data. What would she say if she knew Clara had his sons balancing on weak legs without supervision? As if summoned by his doubts, Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Margaret lit the screen. "Checking in tonight. Any progress?" He stared at it, the irony almost unbearable. Clara gathered the boys back onto the rug, distracting them with wooden blocks. She hummed, again, a tune Richard had never heard before, something soft, almost ancient. The triplets responded instantly, swaying their bodies, reaching toward her voice as if it guided their limbs. Richard's heart ached. For months, all he had heard in his mansion was the cold instructions of therapists. 1, 2, push, relax. Again. But now, for the first time, his home was filled with laughter. His sons weren't just patients. They were alive. Still, he couldn't shake the fear. "Where did you learn this?" he demanded, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. Clara's gaze lingered on the boys before she met his eyes. "My grandmother taught me. She raised children in the mountains of New Mexico, children the doctors gave up on. She believed music and freedom could awaken parts of the body that medicine overlooks." Richard frowned. "That's folklore, not science." "Maybe," she whispered, "but tell me, Mr. Halstrom, have you ever seen your sons smile this way during therapy?" The question silenced him. He hadn't, not once. The front door slammed, breaking the fragile moment. Margaret's voice rang down the hall, sharp and authoritative. "Richard, where are they?" Clara's calm expression faltered. She knew what was coming. Margaret swept into the living room, her grey hair tied back in a neat bun, her navy suit immaculate despite the drizzle outside. She set down her medical bag with precision. "What's happening here?" Richard opened his mouth, but it was too late. Margaret had already seen the triplets leaning forward, trying again to stand. Her face froze, caught between astonishment and alarm. This is dangerous," she whispered, rushing to the boys. "Their muscles aren't ready for this. Who allowed this?" Richard hesitated. Clara stepped forward, her voice steady. "I did." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You? You're a caretaker, not a physician. You're gambling with their future." The tension in the room thickened. Richard stood torn between two women, one with the authority of science and one with the warmth of faith. He wanted to protect his sons, but more than anything, he wanted them to live, to truly live. Margaret turned to him, her tone sharp as steel. "You need to make a choice, Richard. Either you dismiss this woman tonight, or I withdraw my medical oversight." The triplets clapped at a small victory on the rug, their laughter ringing through the mansion like bells. But Richard could barely breathe, because in that moment he realized the choice wasn't just about a nanny or a doctor. It was about the very soul of his family, and which path he would risk for love, healing, and redemption. And deep inside, a new fear began to grow. What if Clara wasn't just a nanny at all, but someone hiding a truth too heavy to face? Rain lingered over Portland like a grey veil the next morning, soft and persistent, beading along the iron railings that looked down toward the Willamette. Inside the Halstrom mansion, silence reigned. Until the triplets awoke with small thumps against crib rails and the sudden flutter of baby laughter that once felt foreign in this house. Richard paused at the bedroom door, listening. Their joy always cut through him. It made him hopeful and terrified at the same time. Downstairs, the scent of fresh coffee mingled with oatmeal and warm butter. May Whitaker, the family's long-time maid, moved about the kitchen with a practiced rhythm. 62, sturdy as an oak, Tillamook born and raised. She had seen this home at its brightest and its darkest, and her eyes held the kind of truth that loved a family even when it broke. "Mornin', Mr. Halstrom," she said, sliding a mug toward him. "You didn't sleep." "I slept some," he lied. He had spent most of the night replaying the image of Ethan's trembling legs, Clara's steady hands, and Margaret's warning like a siren in his skull. "Either you dismiss this woman tonight, or I withdraw my medical oversight." May set a bowl on the counter. "Those boys, I haven't heard them giggle like that since." She stopped herself before finishing the sentence about the wife who never came home. "They're different around the nanny." "Different isn't what the doctors recommended," he muttered, staring into the coffee. "Doctors recommended a lot that never brought a smile to those children," May replied softly. "Smiles ain't medicine, but they can change how a child fights." Richard didn't answer. A moment later, he opened his phone and typed 3 words to Margaret. "I'll document everything." The reply came back instantly. "Good. I'll arrange a schedule." By noon, boxes arrived. Discreet. Cameras, motion sensors, a hub that synced to his phone. Richard installed them himself. The millionaire in shirt sleeves, scaling step stools, testing angles, tightening screws along doorframes and bookshelves. A lens above the mantel. Another across from the therapy corner. One near the kitchen island where Clara often sang. He told himself it was about safety and science, not suspicion. But when he set the last camera to record, he felt like a man locking a door on his own faith, Clara noticed. Of course she did. She didn't protest. She only nodded and met his eyes. "If it helps you breathe," she said gently, "then put the whole sky under a lens." And she returned to the boys, humming a tune that curled through the air like a ribbon, low, ancient, tender. The afternoon unfolded in a pattern Richard had not seen during clinical sessions. Clara placed the triplets barefoot on a soft rug, then sat cross-legged at their level. She tapped the floor with a wooden spoon. 3 steady beats, then a pause. 3 beats, then a pause. She matched their tiny movements with the rhythm, hands hovering without forcing. Ethan reached, missed, reached again. Caleb rocked forward and caught himself. Noah, stubborn and quiet, gripped the couch and lifted, just a breath, but lifted. Each effort earned a clap, a whisper, a smile that felt like sunlight cutting through rain. "Where did you learn that beat?" Richard asked from the doorway. "From my grandmother," Clara said, never breaking the rhythm. "She used to say some muscles wake up when the heart recognizes a pattern." "Your grandmother, the one from New Mexico?" Clara nodded. "A village near the Sangre de Cristo. People there learned to listen with their hands. We were poor. We practiced patience like it was a religion." It sounded like folklore to him, but the results pulled at his certainty. Behind him, the therapy machines sat like expensive statues, polished. Metal, blinking lights, plush straps so clean they looked unused. The contrast embarrassed him. All that money and none of it had coaxed a laugh like the one spilling out of his sons right now. At 4 o'clock, Dr. Margaret Ellison arrived with a folder tucked under her arm. She didn't smile. She didn't greet Clara. She positioned herself by the therapy corner and began to ask crisp questions about range, tone, and compliance with the written plan. She measured ankles and knees with cool fingers, examining reflexes while the boys squirmed and fussed. When the triplets reached toward Clara, Margaret frowned. "We're confusing them," she said. "Mixed signals lead to mixed outcomes." Richard studied the two women, one armored in credentials, one in warmth, and felt the divide open like a fault line across his home. "I've put cameras up," he told Margaret, trying to sound neutral. "We'll record everything." "Good," she said. "I'll review the footage nightly. If there are deviations from protocol, we'll correct them." Clara's face didn't change, but Richard saw the flicker in her eyes. Pain, resignation, perhaps both. She returned to the rug with the boys, softer now, and let the doctors talk around her like wind around a lighthouse. That evening, the triplets fell asleep to the steady hush of Oregon rain. Richard carried his laptop to the den and opened the camera feed. Hours of footage waited, clusters of blue timestamps like stars. He watched in fast forward, then slowed it to real time. He saw things he'd never noticed when he was in the room. Clara's palms poised an inch above a quivering knee, as if lending courage without weight. The triplets' eyes tracking the arc of her spoon like a comet. Her whisper, "There you go, brave boy, there you go," braiding patience into movement. He expected recklessness. He found restraint. Still, at 7:22 p.m., there was a scare. Noah let go too soon and folded onto the rug with a soft cry. Richard's pulse spiked. On the screen, Clara stopped the game, pressed her ear to his little chest, counted the breaths, with the focus of a surgeon, then kissed his hair and held him until the storm passed. No dramatics, no bravado, just a calm that steadied the world. He watched more. At dinner, the nanny added something green to the boys' bowls, minced herbs, maybe rosemary, a splash of bone broth, blueberries mashed with a fork until their skins burst into purple galaxies. May hovered nearby like a guardian, and Richard caught snatches of talk. "Thoughtful food isn't magic," Clara said, "but it gives the child a place to stand." May answered, tapping a spoon against the pot, "and the heart gives him a reason to try." Later, after the house settled, the cameras caught a different quiet. At 11:48 p.m., the kitchen lamp painted a small gold circle on the island. Clara sat alone, elbows close, a spiral notebook open. Her lips moved without sound. She traced small diagrams, little footstep patterns, arrows, beats arranged like constellations. She took from her pocket a worn object, a hospital bracelet. Child-sized, its plastic turned cloudy with years. She turned it over, eyes shining in the lone light, as if the bracelet were a prayer. Richard leaned closer to the screen before he knew why. The camera sharpened when her fingers paused. A name ghosted across the bracelet, Leo Reynolds. A date, a silence. He sat back, winded as if someone had opened a door in his chest. Reynolds, her name, her child. He replayed the scene just to be sure he hadn't imagined it. Clara closed the bracelet gently, set it atop the notebook, and began to hum. Not the bright song she used with the triplets, but a lullaby with weight in it, like a river pulling at stones. He didn't know the words, but he knew grief when he heard it, grief that had been taught to kneel and become devotion. When the recording ended, the den was too quiet. Richard rubbed his face, then looked toward the hallway where the nursery lay. He had promised himself that cameras would deliver certainty, that evidence would tell him which side of the fault line to stand on. Instead, the lens had handed him a new question, one he wasn't ready to hold. What is Clara trying to heal? In them or in herself? The next morning, Margaret texted at dawn, "I want daily compliance logs. We escalate to a multidisciplinary. Review next week." Another message followed, clipped and urgent. Also, if she is feeding herbs, remove. Not approved. Richard pocketed the phone without replying. In the kitchen, May hung aprons to dry and watched him with the caution of someone who had carried other people's secrets for decades. "Paper can count steps," she said, "but it can't count courage." He poured coffee and finally asked the question growing like a thorn. "May, did Clara ever mention a child?" May's eyes drifted to the hallway, then back to him. "Some nights I hear a song I ain't heard since I was a girl. Folks sing that kind of song when they're remembering someone they love. Remembering or begging? Sometimes both." By afternoon, the mansion thrummed with tension. Margaret arrived armed with a revised plan and a sharper tone. She circled the room like a hawk, watching for any deviation as Clara guided the boys through her gentle rhythm. The nanny complied, adjusting when told, avoiding the herbs, keeping everything visible. But the music remained. The triplets followed it like a compass. When the session ended, Margaret closed her folder. "We proceed to formal review on Monday," she said. "I've invited a pediatric physiatrist and a developmental psychologist. If the nanny's methods continue to create non-compliant patterns," "Non-compliant patterns," May muttered. Under her breath, "You mean joy?" Margaret ignored her. "We will restrict interventions to approved protocols only, or I will resign my oversight." She left to a murmur of rain and the soft thunk of the door. The house exhaled. Richard remained at the window, watching mist curl over the trees of Forest Park, a city wearing the color of doubt. If he chose the doctor, he might lose the song that had called his children forward. If he chose the nanny, he might lose the doctor and the shield she provided against the judgment of the world. Behind him, the triplets babbled to each other like sparrows. Clara gathered their blocks, then paused, as if deciding something. She opened her spiral notebook, touched the bracelet once, just once, and closed the cover before he could pretend not to notice. "Mr. Halstrom," she said softly, "I can follow every protocol you ask, but please don't ask me to stop believing in them." He meant to answer. He meant to ask about Leo. He meant to confess he had seen her sorrow through a lens at midnight. Instead, a chime sounded on his phone, a new notification from the camera hub. Motion detected, front gate. A silhouette lingered at the iron fence, umbrella down despite the drizzle, face tilted toward the house as if listening for a story. Richard stepped closer to the window. The figure held a notepad. A press badge flashed in a pulse of grey light. Someone beyond this fractured family wanted in. And if the gates opened now, if the world saw a millionaire, a nanny, a maid, and 3 fragile boys suspended between science and faith, who would be betrayed first? The doctor's reputation, the family's privacy, or the secret sorrow threaded into Clara's lullaby? The chime sounded again, sharper this time. Motion detected, front gate. The silhouette raised a hand to knock, and somewhere in the house, a lullaby faltered mid-note. The knock at the iron gate reverberated through the mansion like a thunderclap, louder in Richard's chest than in the air itself. He moved toward the foyer with careful steps, pulling the heavy oak door open just enough to peer outside. The drizzle had eased, but mist clung low over the driveway. A woman stood by the gate, notebook clutched to her chest. Her umbrella collapsed. At her side, she looked young, mid-30s, with sharp eyes and a determination that seemed immune to rain. "Mr. Halstrom?" she called, her voice carrying through the mist. "I'm Elena Price, reporter with the Portland Chronicle." I've heard remarkable claims about your triplets. May I have a word? Richard's stomach dropped. Margaret! It had to be Margaret who leaked something. Who else would dare? He stepped out, pulling his coat tighter. There is no story here. Miss Price, turn around. But Elena didn't flinch. The community deserves to know when miracles happen or when false hope is being sold. Either way, your family is at the center of something extraordinary. Extraordinary, Richard echoed bitterly. That's what they call it before they decide whether to worship you or crucify you. He turned back inside, shutting the door with a finality that made the triplets cry upstairs. Later that evening, Clara found him sitting in the den, the glow of the fireplace flickering across his weary face. Reporters, he muttered, are like wolves. One smell of blood and they circle until nothing is left. Clara's voice was soft. Sometimes wolves protect the forest as much as they prey on it. He studied her. What are you hiding, Clara? She froze at the bluntness. Then slowly, she sat opposite him, hands folded in her lap. I told you about my grandmother. I didn't tell you everything. Richard leaned forward. The bracelet. Leo Reynolds. Who was he? Her breath caught. She reached for words as if they burned. My son. He had the same condition your boys have. We fought every day for 3 years. The doctors called him a lost case before he could even try. I tried every song, every rhythm, every food my grandmother passed down. But it wasn't enough. He died in my arms before his 4th birthday. The confession fell like stones into silence. The fire popped, but no one moved. I should have told you sooner, Clara whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. But parents hear that story and see only failure. I didn't want you to see me as a woman who couldn't save her own child. Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to demand why she was repeating her methods with his sons. Yet when he pictured Leo, an invisible boy he'd never met, he realized Clara wasn't repeating, she was redeeming. You think you failed him, he said slowly. But maybe Leo's fight is why Ethan, Caleb, and Noah have a chance now. Clara pressed her lips together, grief and gratitude twisting across her face. That's what I hope. That's what I pray. The following morning, Margaret returned unannounced. Her presence was sharper than the cold air she dragged inside. I received calls from colleagues, she said, setting her briefcase down, with authority. The Chronicle is asking questions. Richard, you need to shut this down before it becomes a circus, he bristled. Did you leak it? Margaret stiffened, her silence more telling than words. You betrayed my trust, Richard said, his voice hard. I protected you, she snapped. This woman, this nanny, has no medical training. She is a liability, and if you don't, and this, the whole city will see you as a reckless father chasing folklore instead of science. The argument echoed through the halls until Ethan's cry cut through, piercing, frightened. Richard and Margaret froze. Clara was already on the nursery floor, holding the boy gently. The triplets clung to her like vines to a tree. Margaret's tone softened, but not her stance. Richard, you are gambling with their lives. Clara rose slowly, still cradling Ethan. Her eyes met Margaret's, steady but unyielding. And you are gambling with their spirit. What use is a life if it is lived without joy, without the chance to try? Richard watched the two women face each other, one armed with diplomas, the other armed with scars. And for the first time, he wondered if both of them might be right, and whether his choice would fracture his family forever. That night, while the mansion slept, Richard returned to the recordings. He saw the same patterns, the same tenderness, but one clip shook him. Clara kneeling with Noah, whispering, "For you, Leo, for you." The boy laughed, stretching his little arms higher than ever before. Richard shut the laptop, pressing his palms to his face. He was no longer sure if he was watching a miracle unfold or a tragedy repeat. And as the fire dimmed to embers, he realized the walls around his secret life were beginning to crack, and the world outside was waiting to storm in. By the weekend, Richard's driveway had become a battlefield. Reporters leaned against the iron gates, cameras perched on tripods, their voices rising over the drizzle of Oregon rain. Headlines began appearing online: "Millionaire's Triplets defy science," and "Nanny's strange methods under fire." May closed the curtains with a snap. "They're like crows, circling louder every day," she muttered. Inside, Richard paced the living room, phone buzzing endlessly with calls from investors, board members, even the mayor's office. "Your personal life is overshadowing the company, Richard," his assistant warned. "Clients are asking questions." Margaret stood tall in the corner, arms crossed like a judge delivering a sentence. "This is exactly what I feared. You're becoming a spectacle. Fire her, end this." Clara didn't respond. Clara didn't. She sat cross-legged on the rug, guiding the triplets through a soft game of balance, her voice calm against the chaos outside. "One step, Ethan. That's it. Brave boy. Caleb, follow your brother. Noah, hold steady." The boys giggled. "Their progress undeniable," Richard snapped. "Do you not see what's happening? The world is at my gates. Margaret threatening lawsuits, the Chronicle digging into my life. And you—" He turned to Clara. "You keep humming like none of it matters." Clara lifted her gaze, steady and unwavering. "Because they matter, Richard. Not the cameras, not the headlines. These boys." She pointed at the triplets, the tiny hands gripping the couch with new confidence. "If you let fear rule, they'll never learn courage." Silence fell heavy. Then the front door rattled violently. Someone had forced their way past the gates. Richard rushed forward, heart pounding, and pulled it open. Standing on the porch was Elena Price, recorder in hand, eyes wide with urgency. "Mr. Halstrom, listen to me. You don't know the full story." Margaret stormed past Richard, fury in her voice. "You're trespassing. Leave before I call the police." But Eleanor's words froze them all. "This isn't about you. It's about her." She pointed directly at Clara. The room stiffened. Clara's face drained of color. "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded. Elena stepped inside boldly, flipping through her notebook. "Clara Reynolds, 43, born in Santa Fe. She lost a child, Leo Reynolds, to complications almost identical to your triplet's condition. I've spoken to neighbors from her old town. They say she experimented with rituals, old songs, untested remedies. Some called her gifted, others called her dangerous. Families divided over her methods." She snapped the notebook shut. "The truth is, your nanny is not just a caretaker. She's a woman haunted by her own failure." The words cracked the air like glass shattering. Clara stood, clutching the edge of the couch. "Enough," she whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. "I never hurt a child. I gave them hope when no one else would. And I will not let you turn my grief into scandal." Margaret seized the moment. "Do you hear that, Richard? She admits it herself. She's repeating her past mistakes with your sons. How many more children must be risked before you see the truth?" Richard's chest tightened. He looked at Clara, at the boys crawling toward her, at the faint echo of Leo's name engraved on that hidden bracelet. Could it be true that she was dragging his sons into the shadow of her own tragedy? Clara met his gaze, tears brimming but unyielding. "Yes, I lost Leo, and every night since, I've begged God for another chance. Not to erase my pain, but to turn it into light for someone else. Maybe for your sons." The triplets laughed, tugging at her sleeve, unaware of the storm raging above them. Richard's hands trembled. He was standing on a razor's edge, between science and faith, fear and hope, betrayal and redemption. And whichever choice he made would either save his children or destroy everything he had left. That night the mansion did not sleep. Rain lashed against the windows. The reporters still camped outside under dripping tarps, their lights like fireflies in the dark. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, charged with whispers, arguments, and the restless cries of 3 boys, too, young to understand that their fate had become a battlefield. Richard stood by the nursery door, staring at his sons as they drifted back to sleep, their tiny chests rising and falling in rhythm. He longed for the peace of that rhythm, but his mind spun with Margaret's accusations and Eleanor's revelations. Downstairs, the fireplace crackled. Margaret had planted herself in the den, folder after folder spread across the table. Medical journals, case studies, reports of alternative therapies gone wrong. She stabbed at the papers like weapons. "Richard, I won't stand by while history repeats itself. If Clara stays, I resign my role as physician of record, and when the courts ask why, I'll tell them exactly what's happening here." May leaned against the doorway, arms folded across her chest, her voice edged with scorn. "History. Those boys are standing on their own legs for the first time. Maybe you're too proud to see it." "Pride," Margaret shot back. "This is about science, not superstition. A dead child doesn't make her an expert. It makes her reckless." Clara entered then, her face pale but her back straight. "Stop using Leo's death like a weapon. You don't know what it is to hold your child as life leaves him. You don't know the weight of that silence." The room fell quiet. The only sound, the storm gnawing at the windows. Richard closed his eyes. Enough. His voice carried a finality that startled them all. He stepped forward, the weight of his fortune and failures heavy on his shoulders. "Tomorrow, I'll allow an independent review, not just Margaret's circle. I'll bring in a new specialist, someone neutral. If Clara's methods have merit, they'll prove it. If not, she'll go." Margaret's lips tightened, but she nodded, satisfied for now. Clara only lowered her head, whispering something that sounded like a prayer. The following day, a black sedan rolled up the driveway. Out stepped Dr. Laura Bennett, a young pediatric physiotherapist from Eugene, her approach softer than Margaret's, but no less professional. She wore jeans under her coat and sneakers instead of heels. "I'm here to observe," she told Richard with a quiet smile. "No bias, just the children." The triplets warmed to her quickly, but what Richard noticed most was how Laura observed Clara, not dismissing her, not mocking her. She watched the rhythm game, the spoons tapping, the humming lullabies that guided the boys' balance. She asked questions, not with disdain, but with curiosity. After hours of watching, Laura finally said, "These movements, they're not without foundation. What Clara is doing, songs, rhythms, this is a form of entrainment. Music can sync brain activity, stimulate motor planning. It's not magic, it's neuroscience. Only we haven't studied it this way before." Margaret bristled. "You're legitimizing folk rituals." Laura shook her head. "I'm saying we may have underestimated what human connection can do when mixed with therapy. I see progress here I can't deny." Richard felt his chest loosen for the first time in weeks. Hope, fragile but real, flared again. But hope has enemies. That evening, as the reporters thinned and the house grew quiet, Richard checked the camera feed again. His hands stilled on the keyboard. The screen showed Clara in the kitchen, alone, stirring broth with deliberate care. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small pouch, and sprinkled something into the pot. Dried herbs. "Ground fine," she whispered under her breath as the steam rose. Not words in English, something older, a chant. Richard's heart thudded. The rational part of him wanted to believe it was nothing more than seasoning, but the cadence, the intensity in her face. This wasn't cooking, it was ritual, and when he leaned closer to the screen, he saw something else. On the counter beside her lay not just Leo's bracelet, but a photograph. A boy of about 3, pale but smiling, eyes hauntingly similar to his own son's. Clara, touched the photograph, then pressed her palm against the pot as if offering it up. The footage ended. Richard sat frozen, the storm outside now raging inside his chest. Was this hope or obsession, healing or madness? For the first time he wondered if Margaret had been right all along. But upstairs, in their crib, his triplets stirred, then giggled in their sleep. Their bodies stronger than a month ago, their laughter fuller. Results he couldn't deny. Richard pressed his palms to his temples. God, what do I do? And in the silence, only the rain answered, each drop sounding like a ticking clock, counting, down to a choice he could no longer avoid. The next morning, sunlight pierced through the grey Portland sky for the first time in weeks. It washed over the Halstrom mansion, gleaming against rain-slick windows, a deceptive calm after so many storms. But inside, Richard's pulse thundered like a drum. He had barely slept. The footage of Clara's midnight ritual burned into his mind. Her whispers, the bracelet, the photograph of a boy long gone. He found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she sliced apples for the boys. The ordinary warmth of the scene only deepened his unease. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, firm. Clara looked up, reading the storm in his eyes. "You saw the cameras?" "Yes." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so May and the triplets wouldn't hear. "You sprinkled herbs into their food, whispered words I didn't understand, prayed over a photograph. What was that, Clara? Science or superstition?" Her knife paused against the cutting board. She placed it down carefully, then folded her hands, steady but trembling at the edges. "It was prayer. Old words passed from my grandmother, words meant to protect children when medicine failed. Leo, my son, he smiled on the days I used them. For me, they're not superstition, they're remembrance and hope." Richard's throat tightened. "Hope nearly cost you your child once." Clara's eyes shimmered with pain. "Hope is the only reason your boys are standing now." The triplets babbled from the playroom, pulling themselves upright against the furniture. Their laughter floated through the hall like bells, living proof of progress. Yet Richard couldn't shake the fear. What if her rituals brought them harm instead of healing? Before he could respond, the front door opened sharply. Margaret entered, holding a folder thick with papers. She had heard rumors of the reporters circling, and her patience was gone. "Richard, this has gone far enough. I've spoken to the medical review board. If you continue allowing this woman to experiment, you could face charges for negligence, custody hearings, headlines that will ruin not only you but your sons." Clara's face drained of color. "Charges? Yes," Margaret snapped. "You're not licensed. You're not qualified. And now the Chronicle is circling like sharks. This ends today." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Richard's fists clenched. He looked from Margaret's icy certainty to Clara's quiet. Defiance then to his sons, standing, laughing, stronger than ever. The truth split him apart. The nanny's methods were unconventional, maybe even reckless, but they worked. The doctor's protocols were proven, but they had brought nothing but sterile failure. He felt cornered until the doorbell rang again. May opened it this time, revealing Dr. Laura Bennett, the young physiotherapist who had observed the boys days earlier. She carried a laptop and a determined expression. "I've been reviewing the footage Richard shared," Laura said, stepping into the den. "There's something you all need to see." She set the laptop on the table and pressed play. Footage of the triplets filled the screen. Noah balancing without support, Ethan clapping to Clara's rhythm, Caleb taking 3 shaky steps before tumbling into her arms. Laura pointed, "These aren't accidents. This is neuroplasticity at work." Clara's methods align with principles of entrainment and motor learning. Whether she knows it or not, she's stimulating pathways the traditional therapy missed, Margaret scoffed. So now you endorse witchcraft? No, Laura replied firmly. I endorse results. The boys are advancing months, maybe years ahead of schedule. You can fight it or you can help document it properly. The room vibrated with tension. Margaret's authority cracked for the first time, her lips pressed thin. Richard exhaled, torn between loyalty to his late wife's sister and the undeniable truth in front of him. But Clara's next words changed everything. I didn't want to tell you this, she whispered, staring at the floor. But Leo, my son, he didn't just die from his illness. He died because I trusted a doctor who ignored what I saw with my own eyes. He told me to stop singing, stop feeding him herbs, stop letting him move freely. He said it was nonsense, and I obeyed. Weeks later, Leo was gone. The silence was suffocating. Clara's voice cracked like glass. I can't undo that choice, but I will not make the same mistake with your sons, Richard, not if it means defying every protocol. In the book, Richard staggered back, the revelations striking like lightning. Clara hadn't been reckless. She had been obedient once, and it had cost her everything. Now she was fighting not just for Ethan, Caleb, and Noah, but for redemption. He met her, a gaze torn open. So this, all of this, it isn't only about my boys, it's about Leo. Clara nodded, tears finally falling. Yes, and if I save them, maybe I save a piece of him too. The triplets laughed again, stumbling toward her as if pulled by invisible threads. Richard's heart cracked wide. He saw Leo in their eyes now, the shadow of a boy he never knew, shaping the future of the three he loved most. Margaret slammed, her folder shut. This is madness. Richard, if you keep her here, I walk, and I take the board with me. Richard turned, chest heaving, the decision tearing him in half. Then maybe you should walk. Margaret's eyes widened, fury and betrayal spilling over. You'll regret this. She grabbed her coat, storming out into the fading sunlight. The door slammed like a gunshot. The mansion shook with silence once more. Clara collapsed into a chair, covering her face with her hands. Richard stood frozen, knowing he had just severed ties with the only blood relative his sons had left on their mother's side. But when he looked back at the boys, standing taller than ever, laughter unbroken, he felt a truth rising within him. The battle had only begun, and outside, the Chronicle's reporters sharpened their pens, ready to expose a story bigger than any of them could imagine. By Monday morning, the iron gates of the Halstrom estate looked like the front lines of a war. News vans clogged the narrow road, satellite dishes pointed toward the mansion as though it were the center of the world. Reporters shouted questions into the drizzle, their voices clashing with the mechanical whir of cameras. Mr. Halstrom, is it true your nanny is experimenting with unlicensed treatments? Do your triplets really have a condition, or is this a publicity stunt? Clara Reynolds, are you a healer or a fraud? Richard closed the blinds, jaw tight. The storm he had feared was no longer at the gate. It was in his living room, echoing through every phone call and headline. The Portland Chronicle had run a front-page article, "Millionaire Defies Science with Triplets Miracle Nanny." Other outlets followed like vultures, framing Clara as either a savior or a charlatan. Inside the house, tension wrapped around every breath. May whispered prayers in the kitchen, muttering curses at the reporters between rosaries. Clara, pale but resolute, tried to shield the boys from the chaos, humming her lullabies louder than the noise outside. The triplets, sensing the turmoil, clung to her legs, their fragile bodies trembling even as they giggled at her songs. Richard's phone rang again. This time, it was the board of Halstrom Construction. "Richard!" The chairman's voice was clipped. "Your personal scandal is bleeding into the company. Investors are jittery. We need you to distance yourself immediately from this nanny." Richard's hands tightened around the phone. "These are my children, not a press release." He ended the call, his blood burning. That afternoon, Dr. Laura Bennett returned. She had seen the headlines, and she carried with her not just her laptop, but a proposal. "Richard, listen. If we can present Clara's methods under supervision, scientific, documented, transparent, we can turn this tide. Instead of scandal, this becomes research. Proof." Clara hesitated. "You mean turn the boys into subjects?" Laura shook her head. "No, into pioneers. Their progress could open doors for thousands of children written off by medicine. But we need to be careful. If we don't control this story, the media will." Richard paced the den, torn between the need to protect his sons and the weight of the opportunity. "Margaret already poisoned the well. She'll rally the medical board against us." Laura's expression hardened. "Then we counter with results." But results required risk, and risk was something the Chronicle wasn't waiting for. That evening, Elena Price, the reporter who had first breached the gate, went live outside the mansion. Her voice carried through televisions across Portland. "Behind me stands the estate of Richard Halstrom, a millionaire father who claims his triplets, once diagnosed with a severe neuromuscular condition, are now walking, thanks not to licensed doctors, but to the unverified methods of a nanny with a tragic past. The medical community warns of danger, but supporters call it a miracle. Which is it, fraud or faith?" The broadcast cut to footage of Clara carrying the boys into the garden, filmed secretly through the fence. The triplets laughed as they tried to step on wet grass, their tiny legs wobbling but holding. To the world, it looked like a miracle. To critics, it looked like negligence. Inside, Richard watched the screen, fury boiling. "They've turned my sons into headlines." Clara stood behind him, voice quiet but unshaken. "They'll call it what they want, but those boys are walking, that's all that matters." Richard turned, searching her face. "And if the world destroys you for it?" Her eyes didn't flinch. "Then let it. I lost one child to silence. I won't lose 3. More to fear." The next day, the media firestorm reached a breaking point. A petition surfaced online demanding an investigation into Clara's practices. Protesters gathered outside with signs, some praising her as the miracle nanny, others condemning her as dangerous and unlicensed. Inside, the triplets grew restless. They banged on the windows, fascinated by the noise, unaware that the world outside debated their very existence. Richard knew he had to act. That evening, he called a press conference. "If they want a story," he told Laura and Clara, "we'll give them one, but it will be our story, not theirs." May muttered, "Lord help us," crossing herself as cameras flashed beyond the gates. The next morning, Richard stepped onto the grand porch of his mansion, Clara by his side, Laura just behind them. The triplets peeked from the doorway, eyes wide at the sea of cameras. "My sons were told they would never walk," Richard began, his voice echoing across the crowd. "But they are standing today, and yes, it's because of this woman, Clara Reynolds. She is not a fraud. She is not a danger. She gave my boys something medicine could not, belief, and belief carried them farther than fear ever could." The crowd erupted, questions flying. Some reporters cheered, others pressed harder, hungry for scandal. But amid the chaos, Richard noticed one figure at the back of the crowd, Margaret. She didn't shout, didn't raise her hand. She only stared, her face a mask of betrayal and sorrow, and as Richard's words carried over the noise, he knew the battle with her was far from over. Because Margaret wasn't just a doctor. She was family, and she would never surrender quietly. The applause from Richard's press conference still echoed in his ears when the blow came. By evening, his phone lit up with notifications that made his stomach sink. Margaret had moved faster than anyone expected. On the evening news, her face filled the screen, stern and unyielding, her voice clipped with authority. "As a licensed neurologist and guardian of medical ethics, I cannot remain silent. The so-called progress of my nephews is being manipulated by unverified practices. My late sister entrusted me with their welfare. I will not allow pseudoscience to endanger them. I am petitioning the court for emergency custody. Richard dropped the remote. The triplets playing on the rug squealed at the sound of the TV, oblivious to the storm. May gasped from the doorway, Clara's face drained of color. Custody? Richard whispered, rage and disbelief strangling his voice. Margaret had gone, for the jugular. If the courts granted her petition, he could lose not just Clara, but his children themselves. The mansion turned into a war room overnight. Lawyers arrived, briefcases clattering against the marble floor, their voices urgent, clipped. She's family, Richard. The court will weigh her blood ties, her medical credentials, heavily. And the media storm is painting Clara as unstable. If we don't counter fast, you risk losing them. In the corner, Clara sat with the triplets, holding them tighter than usual, humming a lullaby that trembled around the edges. Richard caught the way her hands shook, her knuckles white. Finally, she looked up. Richard, if this fight costs you everything, your company, your reputation, don't fight for me, fight for them. And if letting me go keeps your children safe, then I'll leave. No, he said sharply. Don't you dare say that. You're the reason they can stand, the reason this house has laughter again. His voice cracked. I can lose the company, I can lose the board, but I will not lose you. The boys babbled, clapping as if to agree. 2 days later, the custody hearing convened in a downtown Portland courthouse. Cameras lined the steps, reporters shouting as Richard carried the boys inside, Clara close behind. Margaret waited at the front of the courtroom, flanked by colleagues in white coats. A wall of authority against a single grieving nanny. Her argument was precise, surgical. Your Honor, I present evidence that the triplets suffer from a neuromuscular condition requiring strict medical protocols. Mr. Halstrom, desperate from grief, has allowed an unqualified woman, who tragically lost her own child to similar circumstances, to impose dangerous, unverified practices. This is not progress. This is exploitation of vulnerability. Richard's fists clenched under the table. When Clara took the stand, the room fell into a hush. She looked smaller beneath the fluorescent lights, her hands folded in her lap. I'm not a doctor, she began, her voice steady but soft. I am a mother who buried her only child. I carry that grief every day. But I also carry what I learned. The songs, the rhythms, the patience that gave him joy, even when medicine gave him nothing. I see those same sparks in Ethan, Caleb, and Noah. I don't claim miracles. I only claim love. And sometimes love teaches us more than books. The courtroom murmured, divided between skepticism and awe. Richard rose next, his voice a low thunder. Your Honor, my sister-in-law wants you to believe this is about medicine. It isn't. It's about control. For over a year, I followed every instruction, every protocol. My sons didn't improve. Then Clara came, and for the first time they laughed. For the first time they stood. If that is negligence, then call me guilty. But don't take my children away because they dared to hope. Silence swallowed the room. The judge leaned forward, expression unreadable. This case hinges on evidence, proof of progress. If the children truly stand on their own, we need to see it. Not in stories, not in promises, but here, now. Gasps rippled through the room. Clara looked at Richard, her eyes wide. He swallowed hard, then nodded. Bring them in. May wheeled. In the triplets. The courtroom held its breath as Richard set them gently on the carpeted floor. Cameras rolled, pens scratched, hearts pounded. For a moment the boys wavered, uncertain in the strange room. Margaret's lips curved in grim satisfaction. But then Clara knelt, clapping softly, humming that ancient melody. The boy's eyes lit up. Ethan gripped the table leg. Caleb steadied against his brother, and Noah, Stubborn, fearless Noah pushed forward, taking 3 staggering steps before tumbling into Clara's arms. The room erupted. Gasps, cries, the frantic scribble of reporters. Margaret's face blanched, the certainty crumbling from her eyes. The judge raised a hand for silence, voice firm. "This court has seen enough. Custody remains with Mr. Halstrom. And as for Ms. Reynolds, while her methods are unconventional, the evidence speaks louder than speculation. Petition denied." Richard exhaled for the first time in days. Clara wept silently, holding Noah close. The triplets laughed, unaware they had just won their own freedom, but victory carried a shadow. As Richard lifted his sons, he caught Margaret's gaze across the courtroom. Her eyes weren't just wounded, they were calculating. And he knew her war wasn't over, because betrayal, once chosen, rarely ends in surrender. The weeks after the custody hearing felt like living inside a storm that was finally breaking. Reporters still camped near the Halstrom gates, but now their questions were less hostile, their cameras catching images of 3 little boys who defied every prognosis. Clips of Ethan clapping to Clara's rhythm, Caleb steadying himself on the couch, Noah laughing as he took brave little steps. They spread across social media like wildfire. Headlines shifted from fraud or faith to triplets who challenged science. Inside the mansion, the air lightened. Laughter replaced sterile silence. Richard, once weighed down by grief, now found himself kneeling on the rug each evening, clapping along with his sons, humming awkwardly to Clara's songs. May would watch from the kitchen doorway, her eyes misting, whispering, "The house finally sounds alive again." But beneath the joy, a wound remained. Margaret. After losing, in court she vanished from their lives, refusing calls, her pride unbroken. Richard worried about her silence more than her fury, knowing pride could harden into vengeance. One evening, as the triplets slept and the house quieted, Richard found Clara alone on the back porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, eyes lost in the Oregon twilight. He joined her, sitting close. "You saved them," he said softly. Clara shook her head. "No, they saved me." Leo's memory doesn't hurt the same way anymore. Every time Ethan stands, every time Caleb laughs, every time Noah fights to take one more step. "It's like my son lives again, not as a ghost, but as hope." Richard's chest tightened. For months he had seen her as a caretaker, maybe even a miracle worker. But in that moment he saw something else, a woman who had carried unbearable loss and turned it into strength. The true twist came a week later. Margaret appeared at the mansion unannounced, her figure rigid in the foyer. Richard braced for another battle, but her face had softened. She looked older, weary, her eyes rimmed with sleepless nights. "I watched the footage," she admitted quietly. "Not the press clips, the raw recordings Richard sent for the court, the science, the results. I can't explain it fully, but I can't deny it either." Clara stood, unsure whether to defend herself or step back. Margaret turned to her, voice breaking. "I misjudged you. I let pride blind me. You didn't replace me. You reminded me what I'd forgotten, that medicine without compassion is empty." The room stilled. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Clara's eyes softened, her voice a whisper. "I don't need your apology. I only ask you stand with us now. For them." She gestured toward the triplets, who peeked from behind May's apron, eyes wide. Margaret bent down, tears streaming, and for the first time reached her arms toward the boys. They shuffled closer, hesitant but curious. When Noah placed his tiny hand on hers, something in her broke open. The family fracture began to heal. Months passed, and Richard turned his mansion into something new. With Laura's guidance, and Margaret now humbled but determined, he funded a center for child development, a place where science and compassion could walk hand in hand. Clara trained caretakers in her grandmother's rhythms, her lullabies, now recorded and studied by universities. Margaret published papers on neuroplasticity, crediting Clara by name, and Laura bridged the gap, proving that knowledge and tradition could belong to the same sentence. On the opening day of the center, families filled the courtyard, children in wheelchairs, children with braces, children once told they would never. Richard stood at the podium, his triplets toddling at his feet, Clara and Margaret on either side of him. Cameras flashed, but for the first time, the light didn't feel invasive. It felt like truth. "This began," Richard said, voice steady, "because one woman dared to believe when everyone else had given up. My sons are walking today because of her faith and because we chose not to let fear decide their future. This center is for every child who has been told, 'You can't.' We are here to prove that maybe, just maybe, they can." Applause thundered, parents weeping openly, children clapping along. Richard looked at Clara. She smiled through tears, clutching the bracelet of Leo Reynolds, no longer hidden but worn openly as a badge of memory and redemption. The triplets, Ethan, Caleb, and Noah, tumbled forward, holding hands as they took several strong steps across the stage. The crowd gasped, then erupted in cheers, and Richard knew. The miracle wasn't only that his sons walked, it was that grief had been transformed into hope, betrayal into forgiveness, doubt into faith. I'm John Parker, and remember, every story hides a truth. So tell us, where are you listening from? Share your story in the comments so we can reach more hearts around the world, and don't forget to subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive, because sometimes the most extraordinary miracles don't happen in hospitals or boardrooms. They happen in the quiet rhythm of a song, in the steady hand of a nanny once broken, and in the courage of a millionaire who dared to believe in love again.